Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Violet Sorrengail had spent her entire life preparing for a future in the scribe quadrant, where she would spend her days safely cataloging history, reading manuscripts, and preserving the knowledge of Navarre. But on the morning of conscription day, everything changed. Her mother, General Lilith Sorrengail, the commanding officer of the kingdom's military forces, had decided that Violet would not be a scribe. Instead, she would join the Riders' Quadrant at Basgiath War College, where only the strongest cadets survived, bonded with dragons, and became the fiercest warriors in the kingdom. The decision wasn't just unfair, it felt like a death sentence. Unlike her older siblings, who had thrived among dragon riders, Violet had never trained for this. She had been born with a frail body, prone to injuries, and far weaker than the other cadets. Her sister, Mira, tried to protest, arguing that Violet was too physically fragile to withstand the brutal training, but their mother was unyielding. Weakness had no place in the Riders' Quadrant, and General Sorrengail would not allow her daughter to be an exception. As she was led toward Basgiath, Violet felt the weight of her fate pressing down on her. The fortress loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its massive stone walls standing as a symbol of power and endurance. She knew the statistics. More than half of the cadets wouldn't make it through their first year. The rest would be lucky if they lived long enough to graduate. The only way to survive was to prove herself worthy of a dragon's bond, but dragons didn't choose weaklings. If one didn't bond with her, she would be forced out. Or worse, she'd die trying. The first test came immediately upon arrival, the parapet. A narrow stone bridge suspended high above jagged rocks. It was the first and simplest way for the War College to weed out those unfit to be dragon riders. There were no safety measures, no second chances, just one wrong step, and she would plummet to her death. The only way forward was across the deadly path. As Violet stepped onto the parapet, the wind howled around her, threatening to unbalance her slight frame. Below, the shattered bodies of those who had fallen before her served as a grim reminder of what failure meant. She forced herself to take one step, then another, focusing only on the path ahead. But she wasn't alone on the bridge. Other cadets crossed at the same time, some moving with confidence, others hesitating. And then there were those who saw the parapet as more than a test. It was an opportunity to eliminate competition. Dane Edos, her childhood friend and the only person who seemed to genuinely care about her safety, had warned her before she stepped onto the bridge. "Don't trust anyone," he had said, his brown eyes filled with worry. And he was right. Just as Violet found her balance, another cadet lunged at her, trying to shove her off the edge. She barely dodged in time, her boots skidding against the stone. Heart pounding, she fought to stay upright, her entire body tense with fear. She couldn't rely on brute strength to fight back. Instead, she used strategy, ducking low and sidestepping the next attack. The cadet overbalanced, and with one final misstep, he tumbled off the edge, his scream cut short by the wind. Violet didn't have time to dwell on it. She pressed forward, forcing herself to focus, forcing herself to ignore the burning ache in her muscles. By the time she reached the other side, her legs were shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she had made it. Inside the fortress, the new cadets were immediately sorted into their squads. each assigned to a specific training regimen. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the knowledge that they weren't just competing against each other, they were fighting for their lives. The first lesson of the Riders' Quadrant was clear: weakness would be eliminated. Violet quickly realized that she was at a severe disadvantage. The other cadets had trained their whole lives for this. They were stronger, faster, more prepared. She, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up. Every day was a battle, grueling physical training, brutal sparring matches, and endless drills meant to push them past their limits. Injuries were common, and no one had time to care. If she fell behind, if she showed any sign of weakness, she would become a target. And she already had enemies. Among the cadets were those who despised her simply because of who her mother was. The Sorrengail name carried weight in Basgiath, but it also carried hatred. Many of the upperclassmen had lost family members in the rebellion that her mother had ruthlessly crushed years ago. To them, Violet wasn't just another cadet. She was a symbol of the enemy. No one embodied that hatred more than Zadin Riorson, the brooding, dangerously skilled leader of the senior cadets. As the son of the most infamous rebel leader, Zadin had every reason to despise her. He made it clear from the beginning that he wouldn't protect her, wouldn't tolerate any sign of weakness. If she was going to survive, she would have to do it on her own. Yet, despite the hostility between them, there was something about Zadin that unsettled her. He was ruthless, but he was also calculated, watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. There was something else in his gaze, something she didn't yet understand. But Violet didn't have time to dwell on Zadin. She had enough to worry about, especially with Jack Barlow, one of the most aggressive cadets, targeting her at every opportunity. He saw her as weak, an easy kill, and he wasn't afraid to prove it. Every time she stepped into the sparring ring, he was there, waiting to break her. With the threshing fast approaching, the deadly event where dragons would choose their riders, Violet knew that she couldn't afford to fail. If no dragon chose her, she would be forced out of the Riders' Quadrant. And if she did bond with a dragon, she would still have to prove that she was worthy of the power it bestowed. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, Violet began to realize something. She wasn't just surviving. She was adapting. She was learning how to outthink her opponents, using her intelligence where brute strength failed her. The cadets who underestimated her were making a mistake, and soon they would find out just how wrong they were. The morning after surviving the parapet, Violet Sorrengail awoke to the sharp sting of bruises covering her body. Her muscles ached from the effort of staying upright on the narrow stone bridge, but she didn't have the luxury of rest. Basgiath War College didn't allow for weakness. The new cadets had barely stepped through the doors, and already the deadly trials had begun. The first day in the Riders' Quadrant was brutal. The cadets were separated into squads, with each assigned an upperclassman as their wing leader. For Violet, that meant being under the command of none other than Zadin Riorson. The knowledge sent a chill down her spine. Zadin was no ordinary wing leader. He was the highest-ranking rebel child at Basgiath, and he had every reason to want her dead. His father had been executed after leading an uprising against Navarre's leadership, a rebellion that Violet's mother had crushed. And now, the son of that fallen rebel was in charge of Violet's squad. Though Zadin didn't immediately move against her, his dark gaze followed her every move, always watching, always waiting. He wasn't the only one. The other rebel children, senior cadets who had lost their families in the war, shared his hatred. Though they couldn't outright murder her without consequences, there were plenty of ways to ensure she didn't make it through training alive. Before she could even think about that, however, she had to survive the brutal initiation process. The first lesson of the Rider's Quadrant was a simple one: kill or be killed. Their instructors, hardened veterans who had seen countless cadets die before them, made it clear that only the strongest would survive. There were no safety nets, no second chances. If a cadet fell behind, they were eliminated. Combat training began immediately. The cadets were pitted against each other in hand-to-hand sparring, and for someone like Violet, who lacked raw physical strength, the fights were an exercise in pain. She was thrown to the ground more times than she could count, her body battered from the relentless blows of her opponents. Jack Barlow, a ruthless cadet with an ego to match his cruelty, made it his personal mission to break her. He sneered every time she entered the sparring ring, delighting in knocking her to the ground. "You don't belong here, Sorrengail," he taunted, circling her like a predator. "Why don't you save us all the trouble and quit before you get yourself killed?" Violet didn't respond. She gritted her teeth, pulled herself up, and faced him again. If there was one thing she refused to do, it was give him the satisfaction of seeing her surrender. Dane Edos, her childhood friend and squadmate, did his best to shield her from the worst of the training. He intervened when he could, giving her advice, warning her about potential dangers. But his concern felt suffocating at times. He didn't believe she could survive on her own. He wanted to protect her, but Violet knew that if she was going to make it, she had to prove herself. As the days passed, she learned to fight smarter. She might not have brute strength, but she had agility, intelligence, and an ability to anticipate her opponent's moves. She started analyzing the way the others fought, noting their weaknesses, their habits. When Jack lunged at her in the next fight, she sidestepped at the last second, using his own momentum to send him sprawling. The look of shock on his face was worth every bruise she had suffered. But combat training wasn't the only thing that threatened her life. The cadets were also forced to endure grueling physical endurance tests. They climbed sheer rock walls with no safety harnesses, carried heavy loads across treacherous terrain, and ran drills until their legs gave out. Violet's body screamed in protest, but she refused to quit. If she stopped, she was dead. At night, as she lay in her bunk, every inch of her body aching, she thought about Mira's words before she had left for Basgiath. "You are stronger than you think," her sister had told her. Violet clung to those words, repeating them like a mantra as she prepared for the next challenge. Then came the true test, the knowledge exams. Though most cadets worried more about their physical performance, Violet knew that intelligence was just as important in the Rider's Quadrant. The history of the kingdom, the tactics of dragon warfare, the intricacies of battle strategy, all of it mattered. She threw herself into studying, memorizing every detail she could. If she couldn't win with brute force, she would win with her mind. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Some of the cadets, especially her squadmate Rhiannon, began to respect her determination. Rhiannon, a fierce and loyal fighter, quickly became one of the few people Violet could trust. Together, they trained, studied, and pushed each other to survive. But not everyone was on Violet's side. The rebels still watched her, waiting for her to slip up. Zadin, despite his cold and calculating demeanor, intrigued her. He was dangerous, yes, but there was something else beneath the surface. Something she couldn't quite understand. He challenged her, called out her weaknesses, but never underestimated her. One evening, as she left the training yard, bruised and exhausted, she found herself face to face with him. "You're still alive," he said, his tone unreadable. Disappointed, she shot back, refusing to show any fear. His lips twitched, almost as if he were amused. Not yet. Their encounters were brief, but each one left her more confused. He was supposed to hate her. And yet, he hadn't tried to kill her, not directly, at least. As the days turned into weeks, Violet's body began to adapt. She was still weaker than most, but she was faster, smarter. She learned to dodge instead of block, to use her opponent's strength against them. She learned to fight like a dragon rider, but time was running out. The threshing was coming, and with it, the moment that would determine her fate. If no dragon chose her, everything she had endured would be for nothing. And worse, if she failed, she wouldn't just be forced out of the rider's quadrant. She would die. The looming presence of the threshing cast a long shadow over the cadets of the rider's quadrant. Every lesson, every grueling training session, every fight was leading to that one moment, the day when the dragons would choose their riders, or refuse them. And for those who were refused, there was only one certainty: death. Violet Sorrengail knew the odds were against her. She wasn't built like the other cadets, her body, lean and fragile compared to the hardened warriors surrounding her, was a glaring disadvantage. But she had made it this far. She had survived the parapet. She had endured weeks of relentless training, broken bones, bruises, and the constant threat of assassination. And yet, no amount of training could guarantee a dragon would choose her. As she struggled to keep up with the relentless pace of the quadrant, her mother's words echoed in her mind. Only the strongest survive. It wasn't a warning, it was a fact. And the brutal reality of Basgiath was proving it true with each passing day. Cadets were dying. Some were too weak, too slow, or too reckless. Others fell victim to their own squad mates, ambushed in the dead of night or pushed too far in training. And as the daughter of the most feared general in Navarre, Violet remained a walking target. She learned to sleep lightly, knowing that someone might try to slit her throat before morning. She learned to move quickly, avoiding dark corners and suspicious glances. She learned to endure the pain that came with being underestimated, because no matter how much she improved, no matter how many times she bested an opponent in training, there were those who still saw her as nothing more than a girl who didn't belong. Jack Barlow was one of them. His hatred had only grown stronger since their last fight, and he took every opportunity to remind her of the inevitable. "You won't survive the threshing, Sorrengail," he sneered during a training session, his smirk widening as he watched her struggle through another round of sparring. "No dragon will choose you. You're too weak, too slow. You'll be burned alive before you even have a chance to run." She didn't respond. Jack wanted a reaction, wanted to see her crack, but Violet refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she focused on surviving one day at a time, one fight at a time. Dane Eidos remained a source of both comfort and frustration. He was her closest friend, her anchor in a world determined to break her. But his concern for her well-being had started to suffocate her. He begged her to reconsider, to find a way out before it was too late. "You don't have to do this," he insisted one night after training, his voice laced with desperation. "There are other ways to serve Navarre, Violet. You don't have to die trying to be something you're not." But she wasn't trying to be something she wasn't. She was trying to survive. The tension between them only grew as the threshing drew closer. Dane's protectiveness clashed with her determination, and no matter how much she valued his friendship, she knew he would never truly believe in her ability to make it through Basgiath alive. Zadin Riorson, on the other hand, believed she could survive, but not because he cared whether she did. He watched her with calculating eyes, testing her in subtle, ruthless ways. During training, he never gave her an inch. If she faltered, he made sure she suffered for it. If she hesitated, he was the first to remind her that hesitation meant death. But there was something else beneath his cold exterior, something she couldn't quite name. He never actively tried to kill her, despite his hatred for her mother. And he didn't stop others from targeting her, but he also never allowed them to finish the job. It was as if he were waiting to see how much she could endure. One evening, after an especially brutal training session, he cornered her outside the sparring ring. "You're still breathing," he remarked, arms crossed as he studied her with those dark, piercing eyes. "That's surprising." She glared at him, wiping the sweat from her forehead. Disappointed, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Not yet. Their interactions were like a battle of their own, words laced with challenge, tension thick enough to cut with a blade. And though Violet knew better than to trust him, she couldn't deny the way his presence unsettled her. As the threshing approached, the air at Basgiath became electric with anticipation and fear. The cadets who had survived this long now faced the most unpredictable trial yet. The dragons would arrive, hundreds of them descending from the mountains, and they would decide who was worthy of riding them. Those who were chosen would ascend. Those who weren't would die. Violet spent every spare moment preparing. She memorized every piece of information available on the different breeds of dragons, their preferences, their personalities. She studied their history, their habits, their temperaments. Knowledge was her weapon, and she would wield it however she could. Then, at last, the day arrived. The sky darkened as the dragons came, their massive forms blotting out the sun as they circled above the training grounds. Their roars shook the earth, sending tremors through the very foundation of Basgiath. Every cadet stood at attention, eyes locked on the sky, hearts pounding in their chests. Violet swallowed hard, her fingers tightening into fists. This was it. This was the moment that would decide her fate. She glanced at her fellow cadets. Some stood with confidence, certain that they would be chosen. Others trembled, fear stark in their eyes. Then the first dragon landed. A massive, obsidian-scaled beast with golden eyes, its wings folding neatly against its body as it surveyed the gathered cadets. The ground trembled beneath its weight. One by one, more dragons followed, their immense bodies casting shadows over the cadets. The air grew thick with the scent of smoke and magic, the undeniable power of the creatures pressing down on everyone present. And then, the threshing began. The first dragon moved toward a cadet, studying him with sharp, intelligent eyes. A heartbeat passed, then another. And then, without warning, the dragon's flames erupted, consuming the unlucky cadet where he stood. Screams filled the air as the reality of the threshing set in. This was no simple selection process. This was a test of worthiness, and those deemed unworthy didn't walk away. They burned. Violet's pulse thundered in her ears as she forced herself to remain still. Fear wouldn't save her now. Panic wouldn't help. All she could do was wait, and hope that when the moment came, she wouldn't be left to the flames. The threshing was chaos. The air smelled of fire and scorched flesh, screams punctuated by the deafening roars of dragons choosing or rejecting potential riders. The enormous creatures moved through the cadets, testing, evaluating, and in some cases, eliminating. Those who hesitated, those who failed to impress, those who simply weren't deemed worthy were incinerated where they stood. It was brutal, but it was the way of the rider's quadrant. Only the strongest would survive. Violet stood in the clearing, her heart hammering in her chest as she watched the carnage unfold. She had known this would be dangerous, had prepared herself for the reality that she might not survive. But watching her fellow cadets die in mere moments made it all the more terrifying. They weren't given a second chance. There were no do-overs. If a dragon didn't choose you, it meant you weren't meant to live. Around her, the stronger, more confident cadets positioned themselves strategically, stepping forward as dragons landed, trying to appear worthy, trying to make an impression. Some succeeded, meeting the eyes of a dragon with steady determination and earning their approval. Others were dismissed just as quickly, some chased off. Others reduced to nothing but ash. Dane was somewhere nearby, his gaze darting anxiously to her whenever he thought she wasn't looking. She knew he was hoping she would back away, that she would let fear win so he could convince her to leave before it was too late. But she had made it this far. There was no turning back now. Jack Barlow stood tall on the opposite side of the field, his smug confidence unwavering. He wasn't afraid. He believed he would bond. Violet hated how sure he was of himself, how much he relished in the fear and uncertainty of others. She had no doubt that if a dragon chose him, he would be the kind of rider who wielded power ruthlessly. Then there was Zadin Riorson. He stood apart, calm and unreadable as always, his sharp eyes scanning the sky, waiting. He had the advantage of his own lineage. His father had been a powerful dragon rider before his execution. Despite the stigma that came with being the son of a traitor, there was no doubt that Zadin would bond. The only question was which dragon would choose him. Violet had no such certainty. She wasn't the strongest. She wasn't the fastest. Her body was still riddled with pain from months of grueling training, her scars a reminder of how much she had fought just to make it this far. And yet, she was still standing, still fighting. She tried to steady her breathing as she watched another dragon land, a magnificent copper-scaled beast with emerald green eyes. The cadets around her tensed, some stepping forward, trying to claim the dragon's attention. But it wasn't interested in them. With a flick of its tail, it moved on, its massive wings sending a gust of wind across the field. One by one, the dragons made their choices, and the group of unchosen cadets grew smaller. Then, a shift in the air. A shadow passed overhead, and Violet turned just in time to see one of the largest dragons she had ever seen descending from the sky. It was black as night, its scales gleaming like polished onyx, its eyes an eerie shade of molten gold. Power radiated from it, the sheer force of its presence enough to make the strongest cadets step back in awe and fear. The dragon landed with a thunderous impact, its massive wings folding neatly against its back as it surveyed the field. A ripple of murmurs swept through the remaining cadets. This was one of the rarest and most powerful breeds, a sign of strength and dominance. And then, something impossible happened. A second dragon landed, smaller, but no less striking. This one was silver, its scales like liquid mercury, its eyes the color of the storm-touched sky. Two dragons, two impossibly powerful creatures standing side by side, their gazes sweeping over the field. The cadets fell silent, waiting. Then the black dragon moved. It stalked forward, its golden eyes locking onto Violet. The world seemed to stop. She could feel its gaze piercing through her, assessing, testing. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to flee from the overwhelming force of its presence. But she held her ground. She had come this far. She would not let fear win now. The dragon took another step, its talons digging into the dirt. Then another. The tension in the air was suffocating. No one moved, no one breathed. And then the black dragon exhaled a slow, rumbling breath, tilting its head slightly. It had chosen her. The silence shattered as the realization set in. Gasps of disbelief, whispers of shock. Jack's expression twisted in fury, his lips curling in disgust. "No," he muttered, stepping forward. "That's not possible," but it was. Violet barely had time to process it before the second dragon, the silver one, moved as well, and it was looking at her. 2 dragons. 2. The world spun around her as reality settled in. Dragons rarely chose riders, and never in the history of Basgiath had 2 dragons chosen the same person. She felt the bond snap into place, magic searing through her veins like fire and lightning, an overwhelming surge of power that nearly brought her to her knees. This was real. She had bonded, and not just with any dragon, but with 2 of the most powerful creatures in existence. The other cadets stared, some in awe, others in barely concealed envy. Jack looked murderous. Dane looked like he wanted to shake some sense into her. And Zadin looked at her like he had just seen something impossible come to life. Violet had done what no one thought she could. She had survived. She had been chosen. And nothing would ever be the same again. The power of the bond coursed through Violet's veins like liquid fire, searing and electrifying, filling her with an energy so vast it was almost unbearable. She gasped, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of it, her entire body trembling from the force of the connection. The black dragon, now unmistakably hers, let out a deep, guttural growl, as if solidifying the claim, while the smaller silver dragon watched with sharp, intelligent eyes. 2 dragons. 2 bonds. The impossible had become reality, and the air was thick with the stunned silence of those around her. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if time itself had frozen, everyone trying to process what had just occurred. Jack Barlow's expression twisted in rage, his usual smug arrogance giving way to pure, unfiltered fury. He had expected power, expected dominance. And yet, it was Violet, fragile, breakable, underestimated Violet, who had just bonded with not 1, but 2 of the most formidable dragons in existence. His lips curled in disgust. "This is a mistake," he snarled. "There's no way." But the black dragon turned its piercing golden gaze on him, and in that instant, Jack wisely shut his mouth. No one questioned a dragon's choice, not unless they wanted to end up as ash. Violet was still trying to steady her breathing when she heard a voice, not spoken aloud, but inside her mind, deep and resonant like rolling thunder. "You will not fall." The words weren't a suggestion. They were a command, spoken with an authority that sent another wave of magic surging through her. The dragon was speaking to her. The realization nearly knocked the air from her lungs. "I'm not ready for this," she thought wildly, panic threatening to claw its way up her throat. But the bond pulsed again, reassuring, powerful, unwavering. Ready or not, she had no choice now. The smaller dragon, her second bond, regarded her with an entirely different kind of presence. If the black dragon was sheer dominance and power, the silver one was cunning, sharp as a blade. Its voice, when it finally echoed in her mind, was softer, smoother, but no less commanding. "You will learn." Violet swallowed hard. Dragons rarely spoke to their riders. It was a rare and intimate connection, one that took time and trust to develop. But hers were speaking to her immediately, and that meant something. It meant that whatever had just happened, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just rare. It was unprecedented. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but the one gaze that burned the most was Xaden Riorson's. He had been watching her since the moment she arrived at Basgiath, cold and unreadable, a storm brewing behind his midnight eyes. But now, there was something else. A flicker of something she couldn't quite name, surprise, maybe, or calculation. He stepped forward, his presence like a shadow, dark and consuming. "You just bonded with 2 dragons," he said, his voice low, laced with something she couldn't quite place. She nodded, still dazed. His gaze flicked between her and the dragons, his expression unreadable. "That means you now carry 2 signets." Her stomach dropped. Signets. Every bonded rider eventually developed a signet, a unique magical ability gifted by their dragon's power. But no one had ever bonded with 2 dragons before, which meant no one knew what would happen. Would she develop 2 abilities? Would the magic tear her apart? Dane was suddenly at her side, his concern written all over his face. "Violet, are you?" "I'm fine," she cut in quickly, even though her entire body still felt like it was on the verge of shattering from the inside out. The last thing she needed was Dane treating her like she was fragile in front of everyone. "Fine," Jack scoffed. "You think you're fine? You're a liability. You shouldn't even be here." Violet clenched her fists. "And yet, I'm still standing." Jack took a step closer, his eyes burning with something dangerous. He had hated her from the moment she stepped foot in the rider's quadrant, had tried to break her, to make sure she never made it past threshing. But now, she was something he couldn't explain, something he couldn't control. Xaden, however, had seen enough. He turned to face Jack, his voice calm but edged with steel. "She bonded. That means she earned her place. You don't question a dragon's choice." Jack stiffened, but wisely said nothing. Violet exhaled, trying to gather her thoughts as the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. She had done the impossible. But what did that mean for her now? What did it mean for her future? The answer came almost immediately. The black dragon, still watching her with those molten gold eyes, shifted slightly before extending its massive wings. A pulse of energy rippled through their bond, and suddenly she understood. It wanted her to fly. Her stomach lurched. Most riders had weeks to train before they took their first flight. They learned how to move with their dragons, how to channel their power. But there was no time for that now. Violet took a deep breath and stepped forward, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch the black dragon's scales. They were warm beneath her fingertips, vibrating with barely contained energy. She felt a push of encouragement through the bond. She swallowed hard and pulled herself up, her muscles straining as she swung one leg over the enormous creature's back. The moment she settled into place, the dragon shifted beneath her, muscles tensing, preparing. There was no going back now. The silver dragon lifted off first, its wings slicing through the air with powerful strokes. Then, with a single mighty movement, the black dragon launched them skyward. The ground dropped away. The wind roared around her, the force of it nearly stealing the breath from her lungs. The world blurred, the citadel shrinking below as they climbed higher, until they were soaring through the sky, free and untouchable. She tightened her grip, her heart hammering, fear and exhilaration colliding in equal measure. She had survived the threshing. She had bonded with 2 dragons, and now, for the first time, she was flying. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what it meant to carry the weight of 2 bonds, or what powers would awaken inside her. But for now, none of that mattered. For the first time since arriving at Basgiath, Violet Sorrengail felt alive. The sky stretched endlessly above Violet, a vast expanse of blue and silver streaked with the glow of the fading sun. The wind howled past her ears, her heart hammering in her chest as the black dragon carried her higher, until the walls of Basgiath War College were nothing more than distant specks below. She could still feel the weight of the other dragon's presence, their bond thrumming through her veins like wildfire. The silver one circled in a wide arc ahead, moving with a grace that was entirely different from the sheer power of the black. 2 dragons, 2 bonds. Her fingers dug into the ridges of the dragon's back as she tried to process what this meant. There had never been a bonded rider with 2 dragons in the history of Basgiath. No one knew what it would do to her, how it would change her, or if she would even survive whatever power was now coursing through her body. The weight of it settled deep in her chest, heavy with the unknown. And then, the voice echoed in her mind again, dark and commanding. "Hold on tighter, little rider." There was no warning. The black dragon banked sharply, twisting midair in a maneuver so sudden and violent that Violet nearly lost her grip. A startled cry tore from her throat as she fought to stay balanced, her muscles burning as she clung desperately to the dragon's back. The ground spun in her vision, the rush of wind making her eyes water. "You must learn to move with me." She gritted her teeth. He was testing her, seeing how far he could push her. Fine. She adjusted her grip, shifting her weight in time with his movements, forcing herself to anticipate the way his body tilted and turned. The dragon executed another sharp roll, but this time she moved with him instead of against him, keeping herself steady as he dove into a steep descent before pulling up with a powerful thrust of his wings. A pulse of approval radiated through the bond. It wasn't much, but it was something. Violet exhaled shakily. She hadn't fallen. That had to count for something. Far ahead, the silver dragon let out a sharp, keening call, its wings slicing through the sky in a fluid, controlled motion. It had been watching, waiting, gauging. "You are learning," its voice murmured through her mind, softer but no less powerful than the black's. "But there is much more to understand." She barely had time to process those words before the black dragon shifted again, his massive body angling toward the training grounds. The descent was rapid, controlled, the air whipping past her so fiercely it stole her breath. Then, with a final powerful beat of his wings, the dragon landed. The force of impact jolted through her entire body, but she held firm, managing to stay upright even as her legs trembled from the exertion. She had done it. She was alive. The moment her boots touched the ground, her body nearly gave out beneath her, exhaustion crashing over her like a tidal wave. Every muscle ached, her limbs feeling like they were made of lead. She barely had time to regain her balance before the reality of the situation came crashing down on her. A crowd had gathered. Cadets, instructors, even some of the highest-ranking officials of Basgiath stood in stunned silence, their gazes locked onto her. Some faces were blank with shock. Others, like Jack Barlow's, twisted with pure, unfiltered rage. But the one who held her attention was Zadin Riorson. He stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Midnight dark eyes locked onto hers, intense and assessing. He was studying her, taking in every detail, every weakness. And then he moved. Without a word, he strode forward, the space between them shrinking until he stood mere inches away. His presence was suffocating, a force all its own. "You just made history," he murmured, his voice low and smooth. Violet swallowed. "I didn't ask to." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Doesn't matter. Now you're the one everyone will be watching." She already knew that. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the unspoken questions hanging thick in the air. What would happen now? What did this mean for Basgiath? For the kingdom? For her? Dane appeared at her side, his face lined with concern. "Violet, you need to rest. This," he gestured to the dragons, to the impossible thing that had just happened. "This isn't normal. You could be in danger." Violet let out a shaky breath. "I think that ship sailed a long time ago." Dane's jaw tightened. He was still looking at her like she was breakable, like she was the same girl who had needed his help all her life. But she wasn't. "Not anymore. She'll be fine," Zadin said before she could respond, his tone unreadable. "She doesn't have the luxury of being fragile anymore." Something about the way he said it made Violet's skin prickle. He was right. She had survived threshing. She had bonded with 2 dragons. There was no turning back now. She squared her shoulders, pushing down the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty. She had to be strong. She had to be ready. Because whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. Violet felt the weight of her newfound reality pressing in from all sides as she made her way back to the rider's quadrant. Every step was heavier than the last, her body aching from the strain of the threshing, from the sheer force of the magic now coursing through her veins. Bonding with 1 dragon was already a momentous event, an honor that came with both privilege and immense responsibility. But 2, it was unheard of, and the way the others looked at her, some in awe, some in suspicion, some in barely veiled hatred, made it clear that things would never be the same again. Dane kept close to her side, his brow furrowed with concern. He hadn't said much since they left the training grounds, but she could feel his unease radiating off him in waves. Finally, he spoke. "Violet, this is dangerous," he murmured, his voice low as if speaking it aloud would make it worse. "No one knows what this kind of bond will do to you." "I don't have a choice," she said, exhaustion making her words sharp. "This isn't something I asked for, Dane. It just happened." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every tense movement. "And that's exactly why it's dangerous. We don't know what the limits are. What if," he hesitated, his throat working like he was trying to swallow back the thought. "What if it kills you?" Violet didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she pressed forward, ignoring the way her muscles screamed in protest. As much as she hated to admit it, Dane wasn't entirely wrong. The power crackling under her skin, the way her mind seemed to stretch between the 2 dragons, holding onto them both at once, it was overwhelming and terrifying. They reached the barracks, but before she could even push open the door to her room, a familiar figure stepped into her path. Zadin Riorson. His expression was unreadable as usual, but his dark eyes held something she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not surprise, something deeper. "We need to talk," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Dane bristled beside her. "She needs to rest." Zadin ignored him completely, his gaze locked onto Violet's. "Now," she exhaled, exhaustion warring with curiosity. Zadin wouldn't have come to her if it wasn't important, and despite everything, he was her wingleader. With a resigned sigh, she gave Dane a look that said she could handle herself, then followed Zadin down the corridor and out into the open courtyard. The air was crisp, with the onset of night, the sky painted with the deep purples and blues of twilight. Xaden didn't speak for a long moment. He just studied her like he was seeing her for the first time. And maybe, in a way, he was. "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" he finally said, his voice low, almost contemplative. Violet's patience was already thin. "If you're here to remind me how impossible this is, get in line." He huffed a quiet laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "Impossible?" He took a step closer, his presence pressing into her space, heavy and deliberate. "Impossible doesn't exist in this world, Sorrengail. But what you've done, it changes everything." A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Then tell me what it means." Xaden exhaled, glancing toward the sky as if searching for the right words. "A bonded rider shares their dragon's power. That's how it works. But you have 2 dragons. And that means," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't even know what it means. No one does." Violet swallowed hard. She had already figured that much out. But hearing it from him made it more real. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Have you felt it yet?" She hesitated. "Felt what?" His lips pressed together, as if debating how much to say. "The power." A shiver ran through her, because the truth was she had felt something. A strange, electric energy humming beneath her skin. It had started the moment she bonded with the dragons, a quiet thrum at first, but it had been growing stronger ever since. Violet crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly defensive. "And what if I have?" Xaden's gaze darkened. "Then you need to learn how to control it before it controls you." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with warning. And for the first time since threshing, Violet realized just how dangerous this truly was. Xaden took a slow step back, the weight of the conversation settling between them. "Meet me at the training grounds at dawn," he said. "I don't care how exhausted you are. You need to learn what you're capable of before someone decides to kill you for it." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Violet stood there for a long moment, the chill of the evening settling deep into her bones. She had survived threshing. She had bonded with 2 dragons. But now, the real battle was about to begin. The first rays of dawn had barely touched the sky when Violet made her way toward the training grounds. The cool morning air was laced with the lingering chill of night, and the quad was eerily quiet, the rest of Basgiath still lost in sleep. She was exhausted, her body aching from yesterday's ordeal, but there was no time for rest. Not when she had more power running through her veins than any rider in history. Not when she had no idea how to control it. Xaden was already there when she arrived, standing in the center of the training field with his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. He was always watching, always calculating, and today was no different. "You're late," he said flatly. Violet scowled. "The sun isn't even up yet." His lips twitched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. "Let's get one thing straight. You're not like the others anymore. You never were, but now you're something else entirely. That means training starts now." She squared her shoulders, refusing to let him see just how much her body protested the very idea of more training. "Fine, what do we do?" He studied her for a moment before speaking. "First, I need to know what you're feeling." Violet hesitated. "What do you mean?" Xaden's gaze didn't waver. "I mean what's happening inside of you. The power, the bond, the pull between them. You can feel it, can't you?" A shiver ran through her, because he was right. She could feel it. It wasn't just a bond. It was something deeper, something stronger than anything she had ever known. The black dragon's presence was sharp and consuming, a constant hum in her blood like wildfire waiting to ignite. But the silver dragon's energy was different, steady, almost soothing, but no less powerful. And the strangest part, they weren't separate. The energy intertwined inside her, shifting and twisting, forming something entirely new. "I don't know how to describe it," she admitted. Zadin's expression remained unreadable. "Try," she exhaled, reaching for the feeling, trying to put it into words. "It's like I'm standing between two storms. They're different, but they feed into each other. And I can feel them, every movement, every shift in power like they're inside me." Zadin nodded slowly. "That's because they are." Something about the way he said it sent another shiver through her. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You're not just bonded, Violet. You're a conduit. That's why this has never happened before. The others didn't have what you have." Her pulse quickened. "And what is that?" His dark gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite name. "A mind strong enough to hold two dragons without breaking." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her. Because now that she thought about it, now that she really let herself feel the energy coursing through her, she realized he was right. The power was massive, terrifying, and yet it hadn't destroyed her. She was still here. But how long would that last? "All right," she said, shaking off the unease creeping through her. "If I'm a conduit, then what do I do about it?" Zadin's lips curved slightly, something sharp and knowing in his expression. "You learn to control it, or it controls you." Without warning, he lunged. Violet barely had time to react before he was on her, his speed unmatched. Instinct kicked in, and she moved, twisting away just as his hand shot out toward her throat. But she wasn't fast enough. His fingers closed around her wrist, and the moment his skin touched hers, the world shifted. A jolt of raw energy surged through her veins, her vision going white for a split second. The connection between her dragons flared, a crackling storm of power bursting inside her chest, and she felt everything. Zadin's presence, his strength, the darkness coiled beneath his calm exterior. But more than that, she felt the way her own power reacted to him. Not just reacted, reached for him. She wrenched her hand back, gasping. The energy snapped away like a broken wire, leaving her breathless. Zadin didn't move. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. That's what I needed to see. Her breath came fast, her pulse pounding. What the hell was that? He tilted his head, studying her. You tell me. Violet swallowed hard. She had felt his emotions, his power. As if her dragons had momentarily connected them, drawn them into the same current. That's never happened before, she whispered. Zadin's gaze darkened. It has now. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Violet's mind reeled. If her power could do that, if she could tap into something deeper than a rider was supposed to, then she wasn't just a rare case. She was something entirely new, and that terrified her. Zadin finally broke the silence. We keep training. Every day. No one else can know about this, not yet. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of deception, but there was none, only intensity. Why? She asked. His jaw tightened. Because if they find out what you can do, they'll either try to use you, he paused, his expression darkening, or they'll kill you. A chill crept down her spine. Violet had survived threshing. She had bonded with 2 dragons. But whatever she had become, that was a danger all its own. Violet couldn't shake the lingering charge in her veins as she left the training grounds. The sensation of her power reacting to Xaden's presence had been unlike anything she'd experienced before. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something deeper, something dangerous. A connection she didn't understand. She returned to her barracks, hoping for a moment of solitude, but the second she stepped inside, she was met with a sharp, knowing gaze. Rhiannon. Her friend sat on Violet's cot, arms crossed, her expression a mix of relief and suspicion. "I was about to come looking for you," Violet sighed, too exhausted to play games. "I was training," Rhiannon arched an eyebrow. With Xaden, Violet hesitated. She should have known Rhiannon would pick up on that. Nothing got past her. "Yes," she admitted. "I needed to. Figure out why your power nearly lit up the entire quadrant yesterday." Rhiannon cut in, voice low but urgent. Violet's stomach dropped. "How much do people know?" Rhiannon let out a dry laugh. "Enough to be scared." Violet sank onto the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. She had hoped that whatever was happening to her could be kept quiet, but she should have known better. Word traveled fast in Basgiath, especially when it involved something unprecedented. "They don't know everything," Violet murmured, more to herself than to Rhiannon. "Not yet," Rhiannon corrected, "but it's only a matter of time." Violet closed her eyes for a moment, frustration simmering beneath her exhaustion. "I just need to get a handle on it before that happens." Rhiannon studied her, then exhaled. "So what's Xaden teaching you?" Violet hesitated. She trusted Rhiannon, but this wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever was happening inside of her, whatever her bond with both dragons had created, it was something no one had ever seen before. She wasn't ready to share it. "Control," she finally said. "I have more power than I know what to do with. If I don't learn how to use it, I'm going to get myself killed." Rhiannon nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pushing for more. "Then I hope he knows what he's doing." Violet let out a humorless laugh. "I hope so too." By midday, the halls of Basgiath buzzed with the tension of an approaching storm. The instructors had called an emergency strategy session, pulling together all the wing leaders and high-ranking cadets. Something was happening. Violet followed the flow of bodies toward the war hall, where voices overlapped in hushed, urgent tones. "What's going on?" she asked Rhiannon as they found their seats. Rhiannon shook her head. "No one knows yet." But as soon as Major Devura stepped onto the platform, the entire hall fell silent. She surveyed the crowd with sharp, calculating eyes before speaking. "Intelligence reports indicate increased rebel activity beyond the borders of Navarre," she announced, her voice steady but grim. "We believe they're preparing to strike." A murmur spread through the room. Violet's stomach twisted. The rebels. The same ones Xaden and the other marked riders had ties to. The ones responsible for the growing unrest. And if they were planning something big, it meant the War College was about to be dragged into it. Devura continued, unfazed by the rippling tension. Effective immediately, 4th years will begin advanced battle training, including live combat simulations. 3rd years will increase their field exercises. 2nd years, her gaze landed briefly on Violet's section before she continued, will continue as scheduled, but expect changes. Violet didn't like the sound of that. The session ended, but as the riders filed out, she felt the weight of something pressing down on her, a sense of inevitability. Like whatever was coming, she wouldn't be able to avoid it, and she had a feeling Xaden knew more than he was saying. she found him at the edge of the flight field, standing alone with his arms crossed, staring out toward the horizon as if he could already see the coming battle. Violet didn't hesitate. "How bad is it?" Zadin didn't look at her. "Bad," she exhaled sharply. "And you knew this was coming." "Of course I did," he said, finally turning toward her. "You think the instructors get the only intel? I have sources too." Violet met his gaze, searching for answers. "Then tell me the truth." Zadin studied her, then stepped closer. "The truth is, this war isn't what you think it is, and neither are the people fighting it." Her pulse quickened. "Meaning?" He hesitated, like he was weighing how much to say. "Meaning you should start questioning the things you've been told." A sharp wind cut through the field, whipping strands of Violet's hair into her face, but she barely noticed. Because Zadin's words sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just talking about battle strategy. He was talking about the war itself. She took a slow, measured breath. "Are you fighting for the right side, Zadin?" His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left hers. "Are you?" The question hit harder than she expected, because for the first time, she wasn't sure she knew the answer, and that terrified her more than anything else. Violet could feel the weight of the coming storm in her bones. The tension within Basgiath had reached a breaking point, and no one could pretend otherwise. The War College had always been a crucible, forging riders into weapons for Navarre. But this was something else. The instructors had increased training intensity to brutal levels, testing them with near-impossible battle simulations. Fourth years whispered about deployment. Even the second years, who were supposed to be shielded from direct conflict, were being pushed past their limits. The real war was beginning, and everyone knew it. But Violet had more than the looming battle to worry about. The power humming inside her had grown stronger, sharper, and harder to control. Tarn had told her she was evolving, but evolving into what? She'd felt it most vividly when she trained with Zadin, how her lightning had reacted to him, how their connection seemed to go beyond the normal rider bond. She knew there was something neither of them were admitting. And then there was the truth. The truth about Navarre, about the war, about the rebels. Zadin's words from their last conversation haunted her. You should start questioning the things you've been told. She was questioning everything now. The attack came in the dead of night. Violet woke to the sound of alarms blaring through the War College, the unmistakable roar of dragons filling the sky. She threw on her flight leathers and grabbed her weapons before sprinting into the chaos. The halls were flooded with cadets and instructors shouting orders, but she barely heard them. Her mind was on one thing. Where is Zadin? She pushed through the panicked crowd until she spotted him across the courtyard. He was already armed, his dark eyes scanning the sky as Basgiath circled overhead. When he saw her, he crossed the space between them in 3 strides. "It's happening," he said, voice tight. Violet swallowed hard. "What's happening?" Zadin's jaw clenched. Navarre's forces intercepted rebel movements at the border. They're retaliating. Her stomach twisted. And his gaze darkened. And they're not just attacking rebels. A chill ran down her spine. "You mean civilians," he confirmed grimly. "Anyone suspected of harboring them. They don't care who gets caught in the crossfire." Violet barely had time to process that before Rhiannon rushed toward them. "We're being deployed," she said breathlessly. "We leave in 10 minutes. Violet's heart pounded. This was it. The battle was unlike anything she'd ever seen. By the time they arrived at the border, the sky was alight with fire and lightning. Dragons clashed above, their roars shaking the earth, while soldiers on the ground fought with brutal efficiency. Violet barely had time to think before she was thrown into the chaos, dodging flames and arrows as she tried to stay alive. Tairn moved with terrifying precision, his massive form weaving through the battle with devastating force. Violet wielded her power as best she could, calling down lightning to strike enemy riders, but it wasn't enough. The battle was too large, too chaotic. And then she saw it. A group of soldiers, Navarre's soldiers, cutting down unarmed civilians. Her breath caught. This wasn't war. This was slaughter. She barely registered the command before she was moving, Tairn diving toward the ground as she readied her blades. She landed in the midst of the fight, cutting down one of the soldiers before he could kill the defenseless man cowering at his feet. The soldier turned on her, fury in his eyes. "What the hell are you doing, Sorrengail?" She gritted her teeth. "Stopping you," he sneered. "They're traitors." "They're people," she shot back. Before he could respond, a bolt of shadow tore through him, dropping him instantly. Violet turned to see Xaden standing a few feet away, Basgiath behind him. "We need to go," he said, voice urgent. Violet nodded, knowing he was right. This battle was lost. The only thing they could do now was survive. They fought their way back toward their wingmates, barely making it out before the battlefield was completely consumed in flames. The aftermath was worse than she expected. Back at Basgiath, the air was thick with tension. The instructors weren't celebrating victory. They were angry because some riders marked ones had disappeared during the battle. Xaden stood in the shadows, his expression unreadable, but Violet knew. They hadn't disappeared. They had defected. And that meant things were about to get even more dangerous. She barely made it to her room before she collapsed onto her cot, exhaustion washing over her. What the hell am I supposed to do now? She didn't know who to trust. She didn't know what side she was on. But one thing was clear. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning.